In the depths of galactic history, when the Sith were thought extinct and the Jedi stood as guardians of peace, one brilliant mind dared to ask a question that would shatter 1,000 years of tranquility. A grand Jedi temple, its halls echoing with wisdom accumulated over millennia. Within those sacred walls, a pale blue figure moved through shadows, his eyes burning with terrible certainty. Master Fanius, they called him, philosopher, visionary, the most charismatic Jedi of his generation. But in the deepest vaults of the temple, his trembling hands closed around something forbidden. A Sith holocron, pulsing with dark knowledge. And in that moment, as ancient secrets whispered promises of ultimate truth, the fate of trillions was sealed. What happened next would birth an empire of darkness. 50 Jedi would abandon everything they believed. Entire star systems would burn. A war lasting 1,000 years would consume the galaxy. And at the center of it all stood a being who believed he was the only thing truly real in all existence. His name would become synonymous with destruction itself, Darth Ruin. But here is what the Jedi never discovered. Here is the secret that historians would debate for millennia. The Dark Lord who nearly destroyed civilization was once their most trusted friend, and they never knew. His transformation was so complete, his fall so absolute, that when they faced him in battle, they never recognized the master they had honored. Tonight we journey into one of the most tragic falls in Star Wars legends. The story of a brilliant Jedi Master whose quest for ultimate knowledge transformed him into the architect of galactic devastation. From his controversial philosophy to the 1,000-year war he ignited, this is a tale of intellectual hubris, dark seduction, and the terrible price of certainty. So before you settle in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Here is something interesting. About 62% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet, and your subscription genuinely helps this channel grow and bring you more stories like this. I create these long-form narratives specifically for those who love deep dives into Star Wars lore. So if that is you, consider joining our community. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Seriously, I love seeing our global community. Are you winding down after a long day, starting your morning commute, pulling an all-nighter? Let me know. It genuinely makes my day to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. Get comfortable under your blanket, and let's drift together into a story that spans millennia, a legend whispered in the shadows of the Jedi archives, the complete and tragic tale of Darth Ruin. Our story begins approximately 2,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, in an era known as the dawn of the Dragulch period. The Galactic Republic stretched across countless star systems, a beacon of civilization and order, and watching over it all stood the Jedi Order, guardians of peace, servants of the Force, keepers of ancient wisdom. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant rose like a mountain of light above the endless city planet, its spires piercing the clouds, its halls filled with the quiet hum of meditation and study. Within those sacred chambers, Jedi Masters debated philosophy, trained Padawans in the ways of the Force, and protected knowledge accumulated over tens of thousands of years. The Sith had been gone for centuries. The galaxy was at peace. The Jedi believed they had finally won. But in the restricted archives, in chambers where only Masters were permitted, dangerous questions were being asked. Among the Jedi of this era, one Master stood apart from all others. His name was Fanius, and he was unlike any Jedi his peers had ever encountered. Tall and imposing, his presence commanded attention the moment he entered a room. His skin held the characteristic pale blue tone of his species, the Umbarans, a people known for their ability to perceive wavelengths of light invisible to most beings. But it was not his appearance that made him remarkable. It was his mind. Fanius possessed an intellect that dazzled even the wisest masters of the council. His understanding of the Force went beyond technique, beyond power. He sought to comprehend its fundamental nature, to grasp the very essence of existence itself. When he spoke, even those who disagreed with him found themselves captivated by his charisma, drawn to the elegant logic of his arguments, mesmerized by the certainty in his voice. He was a philosopher first, a Jedi second, or perhaps that was the problem. In the meditation chambers of the temple, Phineas would sit for hours, sometimes days, contemplating a single question: what is real? How do we know anything exists beyond our own perception? Can we trust our senses, our emotions, even the Force itself? These were not new questions. Philosophers across the galaxy had pondered them for millennia, but Phineas pursued them with an intensity that troubled his fellow masters. They would find him in the archives late at night, surrounded by ancient texts, his eyes reflecting the glow of holocrons as he absorbed forbidden philosophies. They would hear him in the training halls, challenging Padawans with questions that had no easy answers, and slowly, whispers began to spread through the temple. Master Phineas was walking a dangerous path. Master Phineas was asking questions that should not be asked. Master Phineas was beginning to believe something terrible. He was beginning to believe that he might be the only being in the galaxy who truly existed. The philosophy that would eventually consume Phineas had a name, though few Jedi dared speak it aloud: solipsism, the belief that only one's own mind can be proven to exist. Everything else, every person, every planet, every star in the galaxy might simply be a construction of that single consciousness, an elaborate dream from which there is no waking. For most beings, this was merely an intellectual exercise, a philosophical puzzle to debate over glasses of Corellian wine. But for Phineas, it became something far more dangerous. It became certainty. He would stand before the Jedi Council, his pale blue hands gesturing as he constructed arguments that left even Master Yoda troubled. "I think, therefore I am," he would begin, invoking the ancient philosopher Descartes. "But can I be certain that you think? Can I prove that your consciousness exists as mine does? I experience my own thoughts directly, immediately, without question. But your thoughts, I can only infer them from your actions, your words, the expressions on your face. And if I can only infer them, how can I be certain they exist at all?" The council members would shift uncomfortably. These questions struck at the heart of their teachings. The Jedi believed in connection, in the unity of all life through the Force. But Phineas was suggesting something profoundly isolating, something that severed those connections at their root. "Master Phineas," one elder would interject, "the Force itself proves the existence of other beings. We feel their presence. We sense their emotions. We are all connected through the living Force. Your argument ignores this fundamental truth." But Phineas would smile, that calm, patient smile of someone who has already considered every counter-argument. "Does it?" he would reply. "Or does the Force simply reflect my own perception back to me? When I sense another being through the Force, am I truly touching their consciousness? Or am I sensing my own idea of their consciousness, my own mental construction of what they might be feeling?" The debates would stretch for hours, sometimes extending across multiple sessions. Phineas possessed a gift for rhetoric that few could match. He could take any argument and invert it, twist it, reveal hidden assumptions that his opponents had never questioned, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, some began to listen not with skepticism, but with fascination. Young Padawans would seek him out after council sessions, hungry for answers to questions they had barely formed. Knights would linger in doorways, drawn by the magnetic pull of his reasoning. Even a few masters found themselves reconsidering beliefs they had held since childhood. "You speak of serving the Force," Phineas would tell them, "but how do you know the Force exists beyond your perception of it? You say you serve others, but what if those others are simply reflections of your own mind? Wouldn't it be more honest to acknowledge that your own consciousness is the only certainty, that your own will is the only will that truly matters? These were not merely academic questions for Fannius. They shaped how he viewed the galaxy, how he interacted with others, how he understood his place in existence. If only his consciousness was certain, then the Jedi Code's emphasis on selflessness became absurd. How could you be selfless when only yourself definitively existed? The Council grew alarmed. Master Fannius, you walk a dangerous path, one senior Jedi warned him. This philosophy leads nowhere good. It isolates, it justifies any action. If others are not real, then harming them has no moral weight. Can you not see where this reasoning leads? Fannius's response chilled those who heard it. If that conclusion troubles you, perhaps you should examine whether your discomfort comes from truth or from conditioning. The Jedi teach us to question our assumptions, to seek truth wherever it hides. Yet when I do exactly that, you tell me to stop. Why? Because the truth is uncomfortable. Because it challenges beliefs you hold dear. He paused, letting his words settle over the chamber like frost. I am doing what every Jedi should do. I am pursuing truth without compromise. If that truth leads somewhere uncomfortable, perhaps that tells us more about our comfortable lies than about the truth itself. Late at night, when the temple grew quiet and most Jedi slept, Fannius would descend into the archives. The restricted section held texts that only masters could access. Knowledge deemed too dangerous for younger minds. But Fannius had clearance, and he used it voraciously. It was there, in those forgotten corners, that he first encountered references to Sith philosophy. Not the propaganda version taught to Padawans, not the simplified evil the Jedi told themselves they fought against, but actual Sith teachings, preserved for study, for understanding the enemy. And what Fannius found shocked him. The Sith had asked the same questions he was asking. They had pursued the same logical paths. They had reached conclusions that resonated with his own emerging beliefs. The strong rule because they have the will to rule. The Force serves those who are bold enough to seize it. Reality bends to the perception of the powerful. These were not the ravings of madmen. They were sophisticated philosophical positions, argued with intelligence and precision. The Sith understood something the Jedi refused to acknowledge. Power and will were not corruptions of the Force. They were expressions of the only truth that mattered. The truth of individual consciousness asserting itself against the void. Fannius began to change, subtly at first. His arguments grew sharper, more aggressive. His patience with those who disagreed diminished. He started viewing the Council not as colleagues, but as obstacles, as beings too timid to accept what he had discovered. During one particularly heated debate, he said something that would later be remembered as the moment of no return. The Jedi limit themselves, he declared, his voice carrying through the Council chamber with unusual force. You preach balance, yet you refuse to acknowledge half of the Force. You speak of truth, yet you forbid the pursuit of knowledge that might challenge your beliefs. You are not guardians of wisdom, you are jailers of comfortable ignorance. The silence that followed was absolute. Master Fannius, the head of the Council, said slowly, "We believe it is time you took a leave of absence. Step away from teaching. Meditate on these matters. Perhaps distance will bring clarity." But Fannius only smiled, that same calm, patient smile that now carried something else beneath it, something cold. "You can sense it, can't you?" he said softly. "You feel the truth of what I'm saying, even if you refuse to admit it. That's why I frighten you. Not because I'm wrong, but because deep down you suspect I might be right." He turned to leave, his robes sweeping behind him. At the doorway, he paused. "I will take your advice, masters. I will seek clarity, but I will seek it in places where truth is valued more than tradition, where questions are answered rather than silenced." None of them understood what he meant. Not yet. They believed he would meditate, reconsider, return humbled. They had seen passionate Jedi before. They had witnessed intellectual pride. This, they thought, was simply another phase. They had no idea that Pharnius had already made his decision. In the deepest archives, hidden in a vault that few knew existed, was a Sith holocron. Ancient, powerful, containing knowledge that the Jedi had preserved but never destroyed, kept for study, for understanding. Pharnius had found it weeks ago. He had been visiting it every night since, learning from the gatekeeper, absorbing teachings that confirmed everything he had reasoned on his own. The Sith weren't monsters. They were philosophers who had accepted the logical conclusion that the Jedi feared. Tonight would be his last night in the temple. Tonight he would take the holocron and leave. The Jedi Council believed they had time to save him, time to guide him back. But Pharnius knew better. There was no going back from truth. There was only forward into whatever reality his consciousness chose to create. The theft happened on a night when Coruscant's 3 moons aligned, casting strange shadows across the temple's spires. Later, some would call it an omen. But omens only matter if you believe the universe sends messages. Pharnius believed only in himself. He moved through corridors he had walked for decades, past meditation chambers where he had once taught Padawans the nature of the Force, beyond halls where his voice had rung with passionate debate. Every step carried him further from the life he had known, closer to something he could not yet name, but felt pulling at him like gravity. The restricted archives required both clearance and the Force to access. Biometric locks responded to his palm print. Ancient seals recognized his signature in the Force and parted. The Jedi trusted their masters. That trust would prove costly. Inside the deepest vault, surrounded by artifacts deemed too dangerous for common knowledge, the Sith holocron waited. It was smaller than he expected, a crystalline pyramid that pulsed with a faint red glow. Beautiful in its way. Terrible, certainly, but beautiful nonetheless. His hand trembled as he reached for it, not from fear, but from anticipation. This was the moment, the point of no return. Once he took this, once he walked out of the temple with forbidden knowledge in his possession, there would be no pretending, no diplomatic departure, no amicable resignation. He would be a thief, a traitor, everything the Jedi feared. His fingers closed around the cool crystal. No alarms sounded. No masters appeared to stop him. The temple slept, peaceful and ignorant, while one of its greatest minds committed the act that would define the next 1,000 years. Pharnius walked out of the Jedi Temple for the last time in the hours before dawn. His ship, a modest transport he kept for personal journeys, waited in a private hangar. Within hours, he would be beyond the core worlds, within days beyond all civilized space. But he did leave something behind, a formal letter of resignation, placed carefully on the council chamber's central table. The words were measured, respectful, citing irreconcilable philosophical differences. He thanked the Order for his training. He expressed hope that they might one day understand his reasons. He wished them peace. It was the perfect farewell from a respected master, choosing a different path. The council found it the next morning and felt sadness, yes, but also relief. Pharnius had been growing difficult, his questions increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps this was for the best. Let him find whatever he sought. Let the temple return to harmony. They had no idea he had stolen from them. The holocron would not be missed for months, perhaps years. It was catalogued, certainly, but rarely accessed. By the time they discovered the theft, Pharnius would be far beyond their reach, transformed into something they could never imagine. The journey into the unknown regions took weeks. Pharnius traveled alone, speaking to no one, stopping only for fuel and supplies. He spent his time with the holocron, learning from the gatekeeper, an ancient Sith who appeared as a spectral figure whenever the crystal was activated. The gatekeeper did not corrupt him with promises of power. It did not seduce him with visions of conquest. Instead, it taught him philosophy. It showed him that the Sith had spent millennia grappling with the same questions he asked. They had simply been honest enough to accept the answers. "You ask whether others truly exist," the gatekeeper would say in a voice like wind through dead trees. The Sith answer is simple. It does not matter. What matters is your will, your power, your ability to shape reality to your vision. Whether others are real or illusion, they will bend to you or be broken by you. This is the only truth that has meaning. Thanius absorbed these lessons like a man dying of thirst, finding water. This was what the Jedi had denied him. Not evil, but clarity. Not darkness, but the courage to accept logical conclusions. His destination was a world whose name had been erased from Republic charts, a planet in the Outer Rim that records suggested once held Sith settlements. He found it by following references in the holocron, navigating by coordinates that were millennia old. The planet was dead, or appeared so. Red sand stretched beneath purple skies. Ancient structures jutted from dunes like the bones of giants. But Thanius could feel life here, or something like it, presences in the Force, others who had come seeking what he sought. The Sith clans had survived, not as an empire, not as a unified force, but as scattered bands of dark side practitioners clinging to fragments of ancient knowledge. They were weak, divided, constantly warring among themselves for territory, for artifacts, for the right to call themselves inheritors of the Sith legacy. Thanius found the first clan in ruins that might once have been a temple, 24 beings, mostly human, a few aliens. They were practicing lightsaber forms in the courtyard, their blades crude, their technique unrefined. When he approached, they formed a defensive circle, weapons raised. "Who are you?" their leader demanded. "This is our territory. Leave or face the consequences." Thanius did not ignite a weapon. He simply extended his hand, and the leader flew backward, slamming into a stone wall 30 meters away. The others stared, shocked by the casual display of power. "I am someone who understands what you are trying to become," Thanius said calmly. "I am someone who can teach you what you are fumbling to learn. I am someone who will unite the Sith clans and make them strong again. The question is not who I am. The question is whether you are wise enough to follow." For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the clan members lowered their weapons. The leader, recovering, approached with a mixture of wariness and respect. "What is your name?" Thanius considered. His old name belonged to his old life. That life was over. He needed something that reflected what he was becoming, something that captured the transformation he was undergoing, the destruction of illusions, the embrace of singular truth. "My name is Ruin," he said. "I am the ruin of the old orders, the ruin of comfortable lies, the ruin of all who oppose the only truth that matters." The words felt right, perfect, even. He was no longer Thanius, the questioning Jedi. He was Ruin, the answer to every question, the final truth standing in the ashes of every false belief. Over the following months, he would find other clans. Some he defeated in single combat, proving his superiority. Others he won through philosophy, showing them that their scattered traditions were fragments of a greater whole. Still others he seduced with the promise of power, of unity, of finally achieving what the Sith had always dreamed. And slowly the new Sith Empire began to form. Not yet an army, not yet a threat, but a seed planted in fertile darkness, waiting for the right moment to bloom into something that would consume the galaxy. The transformation was not instantaneous. It happened over months. through gradual steps that each seemed reasonable until you looked back and saw the distance traveled. Phineas became ruin. Ruin became something more, and that something more would shake the foundations of the galaxy. He spent nearly a year traveling between scattered Sith clans, uniting them through a combination of superior force ability, intellectual brilliance, and sheer charismatic presence. These were not sophisticated practitioners of the dark side. They were survivors, inheritors of fragments, keepers of incomplete traditions, but they recognized power when they saw it, and Ruin had power in abundance. More importantly, he had vision, where they saw only their individual clans and petty territorial disputes. He saw an empire, where they practiced the dark side as instinct and rage. He offered philosophy and purpose. He gave them something they had lacked for centuries: unity. The ritual took place in what remained of an ancient Sith temple on a world whose name has been lost to history. Dozens of clan leaders gathered, their followers surrounding them in concentric circles. They came from different traditions, different lineages, different interpretations of what it meant to be Sith. But on this night, they came together. Ruin stood at the center, before an altar carved with symbols older than the Republic itself. He had prepared for this moment carefully, studying the holocron's teachings on Sith rituals, on the ceremonies that bound lords to the dark side and to each other. But he would not simply repeat what others had done. He would create something new, something that reflected his truth. The ceremony began at midnight, under a moonless sky. Ruin raised his arms, and the Force responded, swirling around the gathering like a living thing. Those present felt it immediately, a pressure in the air, a weight of power that made breathing difficult. "I stand before you not as Phineas of the Jedi," Ruin declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the ruins. "That being is dead. He died the moment he accepted truth over comfortable illusion. I stand before you as Ruin, as the one whose consciousness is the only certainty in all this galaxy, as the one whose will shall reshape reality itself." He spoke then of his philosophy, but not as he had to the Jedi, not as questions and debates. He spoke it as revealed truth, as the foundation of a new Sith order, and he formalized it into what would become known as the Creed of Ruin. There is no passion, only obsession. There is no knowledge, only conviction. There is no purpose, only will. There is nothing, only me. The words resonated through the Force, each phrase sinking into the minds of those gathered. Some felt repulsed, some felt liberated, but all felt the power behind them, the absolute certainty that transformed philosophy into something approaching religious fervor. One by one, the clan leaders came forward. One by one, they knelt before Ruin and swore allegiance, not to an ideal, not to a tradition, but to him personally, to his will, to his vision of what the Sith would become. By dawn, it was complete. Darth Ruin stood as the first Dark Lord of the Sith in nearly 1,000 years. The clans were united under his banner. The new Sith Empire had been born. But Ruin was not satisfied with mere scattered cultists and forgotten clans. He wanted more. He wanted validation of his philosophy, on the grandest scale possible. He wanted Jedi. The messages were sent carefully, anonymously, encrypted through channels that could not be traced back to him. They went to specific individuals, knights and masters who Ruin remembered as questioners, as independent thinkers, as beings who had always seemed slightly uncomfortable with the Jedi's rigid certainty. The messages were masterful works of manipulation. They did not mention the Sith. They did not speak of the dark side. Instead, they posed questions. They suggested possibilities. They planted seeds of doubt, dressed as intellectual curiosity. Have you ever wondered whether the Jedi truly serve the Force, or merely their own interpretation of it? Do you feel constrained by traditions that resist examination? Is there knowledge the Council keeps from you, not for your protection, but for theirs? Each message was tailored to its recipient, touching on personal frustrations, individual philosophical leanings, specific moments of doubt that Ruin remembered from his time in the Order. He knew these Jedi. He had taught some of them. He understood exactly which questions would resonate with which minds. The responses came slowly. At first, a knight here, a master there, each following the coordinates provided in the messages, each believing they were pursuing independent investigation. They traveled to the Outer Rim, to a world Ruin had prepared specifically for their arrival. They expected perhaps a scholar, a researcher, someone who shared their questions and might have answers. What they found was their former master Fanius transformed into something they could barely recognize. The shock was absolute. Master Fanius, one of the first arrivals, stammered, staring at the pale figure before them. The Jedi robes were gone, replaced by garments of black and deep crimson. The warm presence in the Force had become cold, sharp, overwhelming. We thought you had left to pursue study. We thought you were finding peace. Peace. Ruin's laugh held no humor. I have found something far more valuable than peace. I have found truth. The truth the Jedi fear. The truth that will set you free if you are strong enough to accept it. What followed were weeks of the most intensive philosophical combat these Jedi had ever experienced. Ruin did not torture them. He did not force them. He simply talked. He debated. He systematically dismantled every belief they held, using logic they could not refute, asking questions they could not answer, presenting arguments that made terrible sense. Some tried to leave. Ruin would not permit it, using the Force to hold them, to keep them present. You came seeking truth, he would say. You will stay until you have found it, or until it has found you. The pressure was immense. Cut off from the Jedi Temple, surrounded by Sith, bombarded daily with philosophy that struck at the foundations of their identity, these knights and masters began to crack. Their certainty eroded, their faith wavered, and one by one, they fell. The first to turn was a knight named Corvus, a human who had always questioned the Council's authority. He knelt before Ruin and renounced his Jedi vows, accepting the dark side as the path to true understanding. Others followed. Within 2 months, all 50 of the Jedi who had responded to Ruin's messages had joined him. The Jedi Council noticed, of course, 50 departures in such a short time was unprecedented. They called it the Fourth Great Schism, the latest in a series of mass departures that had scarred the Order's history. But they did not understand the truth. They believed these Jedi had left for various personal reasons, drawn by curiosity or disillusionment. They never connected it to Fanius. Why would they? He had left peacefully, months earlier. His departure had been amicable, respectful, and the Jedi who now abandoned the Order spoke of seeking truth, of philosophical differences, of needing to explore the Force beyond the Council's restrictions. These were their own words, their own reasons. The Jedi Council could not imagine that their respected colleague had orchestrated the entire thing, that he had carefully selected and seduced 50 of their own, that he was building an army specifically designed to destroy them. With his new followers, Ruin's empire grew exponentially. These were not crude dark side practitioners. These were fully trained Jedi Knights and Masters, beings who understood lightsaber combat at the highest levels, who could manipulate the Force with precision and power. And now they served him. He organized them carefully, assigning roles based on their strengths. Former Guardians became military commanders. Consulars became advisors and governors, sentinels became intelligence operatives, and assassins. Each had a place in his vision, each served his will. The Sith, who had been with him from the beginning, watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Some were awed by Ruin's power to corrupt Jedi so completely. Others felt threatened by these newcomers who seemed to hold privileged positions in the hierarchy, but all understood that something historic was happening. The Sith had returned, not as scattered bands of survivors, but as an organized empire with a clear leader, trained Force users, and a philosophy that unified them. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Sith were a threat to galactic civilization itself. And at the center of it all stood Darth Ruin, the Umbaran, who believed he was the only being who truly existed, commanding an army of followers who increasingly wondered whether they should adopt that same belief about themselves. The seeds of the Empire's destruction were planted in the very moment of its creation. But Ruin could not see them. His philosophy made him blind to the one truth that would eventually destroy him. Other beings were just as real as he was, and they had wills of their own. The first strike came without warning, as all truly effective attacks do. A Republic outpost on the edge of known space, a small garrison protecting mining colonies that fed Coruscant's endless appetite for resources. It was defended by local security forces and a single Jedi Knight, a young Twi'lek named Serene, who had taken the post hoping for quiet contemplation. She died in the first 30 seconds of the assault. The attackers wore black and crimson, their lightsabers burning red against the darkness of space. They fought with techniques she recognized, Jedi forms executed with precision and power, but twisted somehow. Aggressive where they should have been defensive, brutal where they should have been controlled. In her final moments, as a crimson blade pierced her chest, Serene looked into the eyes of her killer and saw something that froze her blood. She recognized him, Corvus, a knight she had trained alongside in the temple, a friend who had left the Order months ago, citing personal reasons. But this was not the man she remembered. His eyes held nothing but cold certainty, and as her life faded, she heard him whisper words that made no sense. There is nothing, only him. Within hours, the outpost was destroyed, the mining colonies seized, and the attackers vanished back into the unknown regions. The Republic received the distress signal too late. By the time ships arrived, they found only bodies and the lingering presence of the dark side thick enough to make even non-Force sensitives feel ill. The Jedi Council convened immediately. One dead knight was tragedy enough. But the reports from survivors spoke of multiple Force users, all wielding red lightsabers, all fighting with Jedi techniques. This was not random violence. This was organized, military, precise. Impossible. One master breathed. The Sith have been extinct for 1,000 years. We destroyed them. We ended their threat forever. But Master Yoda, eldest among them, sat in troubled silence. Ended, the Sith are not, he finally said, his voice heavy with ancient memory. Sleeping, they were, waiting. Now awakened they have, and strong, their awakening feels. Over the following weeks, more attacks came, never against major worlds, never against targets the Republic could defend easily. Darth Ruin was too intelligent for that. He struck at the edges, at vulnerable points, at colonies and outposts that could be overwhelmed before help arrived. Each victory brought him resources, territory, and most importantly, validation. His philosophy was proving itself. His will was reshaping reality. The galaxy was bending to his vision. The tactical brilliance Ruin displayed stunned military analysts who later studied these campaigns. He had spent decades as a Jedi, learning strategy, studying conflicts, understanding how the Republic and the Jedi Order responded to threats. Now he used that knowledge against them with devastating effectiveness. He knew the Jedi would spread themselves thin trying to defend every threatened world. So he created more threats than they could possibly address. He knew the Republic Senate would debate endlessly before committing forces. So he struck and withdrew before political consensus could form. He understood that both institutions relied on predictability, on following established procedures, so he did nothing predictable. But it was Ruin's treatment of his own forces that truly set him apart from conventional commanders. He spent lives like currency, sacrificing entire units if it served his strategic goals. When his Sith lords questioned this approach, he would explain with perfect calm that individual soldiers were not real in any meaningful sense. They existed as extensions of his will. Their deaths served his purpose. Therefore, their deaths had meaning, even if they themselves did not. This philosophy should have devastated morale. Soldiers do not typically fight well when their commander considers them expendable illusions, but Ruin had chosen his followers carefully, and he reinforced his philosophy constantly. Those who served him began to believe what he believed, or at least they pretended to believe it. And in war, the distinction between genuine faith and performed faith matters less than results. The results were undeniable. Within a year of the first attack, Ruin controlled dozens of systems. Within 2 years, over 100. The new Sith Empire was expanding faster than any military force in recent galactic history, and the Republic seemed powerless to stop it. The Jedi Order mobilized fully for the first time in centuries. Masters who had spent decades in meditation suddenly found themselves commanding troops. Knights who had studied philosophy were thrust into combat. Padawans barely out of training were sent to the front lines because there were not enough experienced Jedi to fill the need. And on those front lines, they encountered something that shook them to their core. Former Jedi, friends, colleagues, teachers, people they had known, respected, trained alongside, now serving the Sith, now trying to kill them. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you fight someone who once saved your life? How do you strike down a master who taught you lightsaber forms? The Sith had no such hesitation. They had renounced their past completely, accepted Ruin's truth, and fought with the fervor of converts. Ruin established his capital on a fortress world deep in the Outer Rim, a planet he renamed simply Imperium. The transformation of this world revealed his vision for the galaxy. Ancient Sith architecture was rebuilt and expanded. Temples rose from red sand, their spires reaching toward alien stars. Academies trained new generations of dark side practitioners, not in rage and passion as the old Sith had, but in cold philosophical certainty. At the heart of Imperium, Ruin constructed his palace. It was not ornate or grandiose. It was stark, geometric, reflecting his belief in the supremacy of consciousness over decoration. The throne room held a single chair of black stone, and when Ruin sat upon it, he could look out through massive transparistile walls at the empire he was building. He would sit there for hours, feeling the dark side flow through thousands of followers across hundreds of worlds, all bound to his will, all serving his vision. In those moments, he felt something close to contentment. This was proof. This was validation. His consciousness was reshaping reality on a galactic scale. But even then, in his moments of greatest triumph, something troubled him. A whisper of doubt he could never quite silence. When he reached out through the Force to his followers, he felt their presence, distinct, individual, separate from his own consciousness. They seemed real. They felt real. But his philosophy said they could not be real. So what was he feeling? He pushed the question away. Doubt was weakness. Certainty was strength. He had committed to his truth. He would not waver now. The introduction of Lord Eradicus came during this period of expansion. A young human who had been among the 50 Jedi converts, Eradicus possessed both exceptional force ability and absolute devotion to Ruin's philosophy. Where others might harbor secret doubts, Eradicus believed completely. He saw himself as an extension of Ruin's will, nothing more, and he considered that the highest honor imaginable. Ruin made him a special case, a squire, who attended him personally, who wore armor infused with the Force, who served as both bodyguard and symbol. When others saw Eradicus, they saw what perfect service to Ruin looked like: total submission, complete belief, the erasure of individual will in favor of the Dark Lord's vision. It was beautiful, in a terrible way, and it was doomed. As the war spread, as more systems fell, as the Republic reeled from losses it could not comprehend, whispers began among Ruin's Sith Lords, quiet conversations in secure chambers, questions posed carefully, never directly, always with plausible deniability. If only his consciousness truly exists, why does mine feel so real? If I am merely his perception, why can I deceive him? If we are extensions of his will, why do our wills conflict with his? The questions multiplied like cracks in ice, spreading through the Empire's foundation, invisible from above, but weakening everything they touched. Darth Ruin had created an empire built on the supremacy of individual consciousness. He had gathered followers who believed in the primacy of personal will over all else, and he had somehow convinced himself that they would not apply these beliefs to themselves. The new Sith Wars had begun. They would rage for 1,000 years, but the seeds of Ruin's personal destruction were already germinating in the minds of those he considered unreal. They would grow in darkness, fed by ambition and resentment, until they bloomed into betrayal. The only question was how long it would take. 3 years into the war, the new Sith Empire reached what historians would later identify as its apex. Over 200 systems acknowledged Ruin's authority. Millions served in his military. Hundreds of Force users bore the title of Sith, training new apprentices in academies across conquered space. From the outside, it appeared unstoppable. From the inside, rot had already set in. Darth Ruin stood before an assembly of his most powerful followers in the grand hall of his palace on Imperium. The gathering represented the Empire's strength. Sith Lords who commanded fleets, who governed entire sectors, who wielded the Force with devastating skill. They had come in response to his summons to celebrate recent victories and receive new assignments in the continuing war against the Republic. Ruin's voice carried across the vast chamber as he addressed them. For millennia the Sith destroyed themselves through infighting. Master turned on apprentice. Lords conspired against each other. The Empire consumed itself from within again and again. But we will be different. We are different. He gestured broadly, encompassing the assembled lords. You serve me because you understand truth. My consciousness is the only certainty. My will is the only will that ultimately matters. This is not tyranny. This is simply accepting reality as it is. And because we accept this reality, we are united in a way the old Sith never achieved. The lords listened, their faces carefully neutral. Some nodded agreement. Others remained perfectly still. All projected loyalty through the Force, or at least the appearance of it. But in the minds of several, thoughts formed that Ruin could not hear, thoughts that directly contradicted everything he was saying. Among those gathered, 3 lords stood out. Darth Vindictus commanded the Empire's military forces, a former Jedi Guardian whose tactical mind rivaled Ruin's own. Darth Animus practiced Sith sorcery and alchemy, creating twisted creatures through Force experimentation. And Darth Sovereign governed the Empire's civilian administration, managing conquered populations with ruthless efficiency. Each was powerful, each was brilliant, and each had begun to question the foundation of Ruin's philosophy. After the assembly, Vindictus returned to his flagship orbiting Imperium. His second-in-command, a Zabrak who had served with him since the early days of the Empire, was waiting with reports of recent engagements. But Vindictus waved the datapads away. "Tell me something," he said, instead staring out at the planet below. "When you feel pain, is it real? When you make a decision, is it truly your decision? Or are you simply playing out predetermined patterns in Rujan's consciousness? The Zabrak shifted uncomfortably. My lord, these questions seem dangerous. Everything worth considering is dangerous, Vindictus replied. I believe my pain is real. My choices feel like mine. But Lord Ruin teaches that only his consciousness truly exists. So perhaps I am wrong. Perhaps what I believe about myself is illusion. Vindictus turned to face him fully. And if you are illusion, if you are not real, then why should you serve him? Why should something that does not exist sacrifice itself for something that does? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither dared voice fully. Finally, the Zabrak spoke carefully. Because he is powerful. Because defying him means death. Ah, Vindictus said softly. So we serve not out of philosophical agreement, but out of fear. Not because his truth is true, but because he enforces his truth with power. Do you see the problem? The problem, my lord. If we serve only because we fear, then the moment someone becomes more fearsome, we will serve them instead. Loyalty based on terror is loyalty waiting to be transferred. Similar conversations occurred across the empire, in different forms, with different words, but always circling the same fundamental problem. Ruin had built his power on a philosophy of absolute individual supremacy. But if that philosophy was true, then every individual should seek to be supreme, including, perhaps especially, his own followers. The cracks appeared first, in small ways. Resources that should have gone to the central war effort were diverted to personal projects. Lords began building power bases in their assigned territories, creating networks of loyal followers who answered to them before answering to Ruin. Ambitious officers started forming alliances, recognizing that their interests might not always align with the Dark Lord's commands. Ruin noticed, how could he not? He felt the shifting currents in the Force, the way loyalties bent and twisted like light through crystal, but he interpreted these signals through the lens of his philosophy. They are testing boundaries, he told himself, asserting their perceived independence. It does not matter. They are not real. They cannot truly threaten me. This might have been the moment he could have corrected course. A different leader might have recognized the danger and adapted. But Ruin's absolute certainty prevented adaptation. To change would be to admit doubt. Doubt would undermine the foundation of everything he had built. So he doubled down, enforcing his will more brutally, punishing deviation more harshly, insisting more loudly that his consciousness alone mattered. The turning point came during a campaign to capture a heavily defended Republic world. Vindictus commanded the assault, leading a fleet that represented a substantial portion of the Empire's military might. The battle was fierce, the Republic defense more organized than intelligence had suggested. Vindictus found himself in a tactical dilemma. He could withdraw, preserving his forces for another attempt, or he could press the attack as Ruin had ordered, likely succeeding, but at catastrophic cost. He chose withdrawal. A rational military decision. The world was not critical enough to justify the losses a continued assault would incur. Better to regroup, gather more intelligence and return with a better strategy. Ruin saw it as betrayal, not of orders but of philosophy. Vindictus had put his own judgment above his master's will. He had acted as though his consciousness, his decision-making, mattered as much as Ruin's. This could not stand. The summons came immediately. Vindictus was to return to Imperium to explain his failure. The word failures appeared 3 times in the brief message, each occurrence like a blade. Vindictus considered refusing. He commanded the largest fleet in the Empire. He had hundreds of officers loyal to him personally. He could simply turn his ships around and carve out his own domain. But he was not ready yet. His power base was strong, but not impregnable. So he went, hoping to argue his case, to make Ruin understand that tactical flexibility was not philosophical betrayal. The throne room was cold when Vindictus entered. Ruin sat in his black stone chair, eyes fixed on some distant point, his presence in the force like winter wind. Other lords stood along the walls, witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. "You withdrew," Ruin said without preamble. "I ordered you to take that world. You chose not to. Explain." Vindictus kept his voice level, professional. The Republic defense was stronger than anticipated. Continuing the assault would have cost us half the fleet. I preserved our forces for a more strategic approach. "You preserved nothing," Ruin interrupted. "You asserted your will over mine. You decided that your perception of the situation was more accurate than my orders. You forgot what you are." "And what am I?" The question came out more challenging than Vindictus intended. Ruin's eyes finally focused on him, and the intensity was physical. "You are nothing. You are a perception in my consciousness. You have no independent existence. You have no will that matters. You follow my orders because my orders are the only reality. When you deviate, you do not become independent. You become incorrect." The silence that followed pressed down on everyone present. Vindictus felt rage building, hot and dangerous. He had conquered worlds for this empire. He had led armies to victory after victory. He had sacrificed, bled, killed for the vision, Ruin proclaimed, and now he was being told he was nothing. That his tactical expertise, his experience, his judgment were all illusion. "I feel very real," Vindictus said quietly. "My thoughts seem real to me. My decisions feel like mine. Perhaps your philosophy is convenient rather than true. Perhaps you tell yourself we are not real because it justifies treating us as expendable." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ruin stood, and the force swirled around him like a gathering storm. "You question me, you dare suggest I am wrong." "I suggest," Vindictus said, choosing each word carefully, "that a philosophy requiring you to deny the obvious reality of everyone around you might be flawed. I suggest that believing yourself the only real being in the galaxy is not enlightenment, it is madness." He knew immediately he had gone too far. Ruin's hand rose, and force lightning erupted from his fingertips. Vindictus tried to defend, raising his own power to block, but Ruin's assault was overwhelming. The lightning threw him backward, slamming him into the far wall. He crumpled, smoke rising from his armor, pain screaming through every nerve. Ruin approached slowly, his expression utterly calm. "You are nothing," he repeated. "This pain you feel, it is not real. It is my perception of what should happen when nothing challenges everything. Learn from it, or cease to be even the illusion you currently are." He turned away, dismissing Vindictus like refuse. The other lords watched, their faces carefully blank, but in their eyes something had changed. They had seen their master's philosophy in action. They had watched him torture one of his most capable commanders over a tactical decision, and they understood perfectly. They were next, all of them. Eventually, because serving someone who believes you do not exist means your service will never be enough. Your loyalty will never be sufficient. Your value will always be nothing. As Vindictus struggled to his feet, pride and body both broken, a single thought crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. "I am real. My will is real, and I will prove it by surviving him." Around the throne room, in the minds of a dozen Sith Lords, similar thoughts were forming. The empire Ruin had built on the supremacy of his consciousness was about to learn what happens when other consciousnesses decide they matter just as much. The betrayals had begun. The torture of Vindictus marked a threshold. Before that moment, Ruin's Sith Lords had grumbled privately, formed quiet alliances, and prepared contingencies. After that moment, they moved from preparation to action. The shift was subtle at first, barely noticeable among the chaos of ongoing war, but it was happening. Vindictus spent 3 weeks recovering in his private chambers aboard his flagship. Officially, he was meditating, contemplating his failure, recommitting himself to his master's vision. Actually, he was coordinating. Encrypted messages flowed between his ship and dozens of others across the Empire. Not open rebellion, not yet, but the framework for rebellion, built piece by careful piece. He was not the only one. Darth Animus, working in her laboratories, began relocating her most valuable research to secure locations that only she could access. Darth Sovereign started transferring funds from imperial accounts into private holdings, building an economic power base independent of central authority. Other lords made similar moves, each preparing for a future where Rusin's authority could no longer be taken for granted. The Republic, struggling to hold territory against the Sith onslaught, began receiving unexpected gifts. Intelligence appeared from anonymous sources, revealing Sith fleet movements, supply routes, weak points in defensive networks. At first, Republic commanders assumed these were traps, but the intelligence proved accurate again and again. Someone inside the Sith Empire was leaking information. That someone was actually several someones, lords who saw the Republic not as the enemy, but as a potential alternative power center. A way to weaken Ruin without openly defying him. If the Republic destroyed a rival lord's forces, well, that was simply the fortune of war. Nothing to do with leaked fleet positions, certainly nothing to do with betrayal. Ruin sensed the shifting tides, but misunderstood their nature. He believed his followers were being tested by the dark side, that their loyalty was being challenged by the temptations of power and independence. This was natural, he thought. Expected even. The dark side revealed truth. And truth was that only the strongest consciousness mattered. His consciousness was strongest, therefore the testing would ultimately reinforce his position. He could not imagine that the testing was already over, that his followers had been tested and found him wanting. The first open conflict came not from deliberate rebellion, but from territorial dispute. 2 Sith lords, both governing adjacent sectors, both ambitious beyond their positions, claimed the same resource-rich system. Each appealed to Ruin for judgment. Instead of settling the matter diplomatically, Ruin gave a response that sealed his fate. Fight for it, he told them. The stronger will prevail. The weaker will learn their place, or cease to exist. It is all the same to me. So they fought. Fleets clashed in orbit. Armies battled on the ground. Thousands died. And when the dust settled, the victor immediately turned defensive, fortifying the system not against the Republic, but against other Sith lords who might challenge their claim. The precedent was set. If disputes would be settled by force, then force became the currency of authority. And Rusin, for all his power, could not be everywhere at once, could not enforce his will across hundreds of systems simultaneously. The Empire began to fragment along the fault lines of ambition. Vindictus made his move 6 months after his humiliation. He did not attack Ruin directly. That would be suicide. Instead, he launched a campaign against Darth Malvox, a lord who governed a sector adjacent to Vindictus's own territory. The justification was thin, some manufactured insult, but justification hardly mattered. This was a power grab, pure and simple. Malvox appealed to Ruin for aid. The Dark Lord's response was delayed for days, then came back as a single sentence: defend yourself or prove you deserve to fall. The message was clear. Ruin would not intervene in fights between his lords. This was not an empire anymore. It was arena, and everyone in it was fair game. The war between Vindictus and Malvox lasted 3 weeks. Vindictus had been preparing for months and possessed superior forces. Malvox fell, his territories absorbed, his followers either sworn to Vindictus or dead. The victor sent a message to Ruin reporting his success and requesting official recognition of his expanded domain. Ruin granted it. What else could he do? Vindictus had the forces, the territory, the momentum. Denying recognition would accomplish nothing except forcing an open break. Better to maintain the fiction of hierarchy, of a unified empire with himself at its apex. Even if that fiction was growing more transparent by the day. Other lords watched and learned. If Vindictus could expand his power through conquest of fellow Sith, then so could they. Within months, a dozen conflicts erupted across the empire. Lords fighting lords, fleets engaging fleets that flew the same banner, planets burning under bombardment from forces that officially served the same master. The Republic, given breathing room by the Sith turning on themselves, launched counteroffensives. They reclaimed systems lost in the early years of the war. They reinforced defensive positions. They rebuilt fleets that had been shattered by Rusin's initial onslaught. And they did it all while watching the Sith Empire devour itself with a mixture of relief and horror. Jedi, who fought in these campaigns, reported something strange. The Sith they faced seemed different, more desperate, more angry, as though they were not fighting for conquest anymore, but for survival. When captured Sith were interrogated, they spoke of constant infighting, of betrayals and assassinations, of an empire where trusting your fellow Sith was more dangerous than facing the enemy. One captured Sith, a former Jedi named Cadil, who had followed Ruin in the Fourth Great Schism, said something that was recorded and preserved in the Jedi archives. We thought we were joining something greater than ourselves. We thought Ruin had found truth. The Jedi were too afraid to accept, but all he gave us was permission to be as selfish and cruel as we wanted. And now we are destroying ourselves with the same selfishness he celebrated. Kale was executed 2 days later by Sith assassins who infiltrated the Republic prison specifically to silence him. Ruin could not allow his former followers to tell the truth about the Empire's internal collapse. The fiction had to be maintained, the appearance of unity preserved, even if that unity was nothing but appearance. Darth Animus made her play differently than Vindictus. She did not seek conquest, she sought independence. In her laboratories on a world deep in the Empire's territories, she had been conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of Sith alchemy and sorcery, creating creatures through the Force, twisting life into new and terrible forms, binding dark side energy into physical matter. Her creations were formidable. Techno-beasts, she called them, beings that were part organic and part technological, immune to pain, loyal only to her, capable of fighting with inhuman strength and endurance. She built an army of them, hundreds, then thousands, and when she felt her power was sufficient, she simply stopped acknowledging Ruin's authority. No declaration of independence, no dramatic confrontation. She simply ceased responding to his summons, stopped sending reports, kept the resources from her sector for her own use. When Ruin sent emissaries demanding her presence, they found her worlds defended by techno-beasts and automated defenses. Several emissaries did not return. Those who did brought messages from Animus that dripped with contempt. Tell Ruin that I have discovered something he has not. True independence. I do not need to believe I am the only real being. I simply need to be powerful enough that other beings cannot force their will upon me. If he wishes to dispute this, he is welcome to come personally. Ruin did not come personally. He could not, because if he left Imperium to deal with Animus, Vindictus, or another ambitious lord might seize the capital in his absence, he was trapped by the same dynamics he had created. The Empire had become a web of competing power centers, and any move he made to suppress one strengthened the others. The reports flowing back to Imperium painted a picture of accelerating collapse, lords declaring autonomy, territories seceding, civil wars erupting across entire sectors. And through it all, The Republic pressed their advantage, reclaiming system after system, while the Sith were too busy fighting themselves to mount coordinated defense. In his throne room, Ruin sat alone and felt the Force churning with hatred, ambition, betrayal. His empire, the validation of his philosophy, the proof that his consciousness could reshape reality, was tearing itself apart. And for the first time since he had left the Jedi Temple all those years ago, genuine doubt crept into his mind. What if they are real? What if their consciousness is as valid as mine? What if I have built an empire on a lie I told myself to justify my own pride? But even as the thoughts formed, he crushed them. No, sir, I cannot be wrong. I am the only certainty. They are destroying themselves because they are weak, because they fail to understand, because they are nothing trying to become something. I will endure. I will prevail, because I am all that truly exists. The delusion held, but barely. And in the months to come, reality would force itself upon him in ways that no philosophy could dismiss. The siege of Imperium began on a morning when the planet's red sun cast long shadows across the fortress city. Darth Vindictus arrived first, his fleet dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation, gun ports already open, fighters already launching. Within hours, he was joined by Darth Animus, her ships bristling with experimental weapons and holds full of techno-beasts. Then came Darth Sovereign and 4 other lords, each commanding substantial forces, each hungry for the kill. They had coordinated in secret for months, building this coalition through careful negotiation and shared grievance. 7 Sith Lords, representing perhaps half the Empire's remaining military strength, united by a single goal, the destruction of Darth Ruin. The irony was exquisite. Ruin had taught them that only individual consciousness mattered, that personal will superseded all other considerations. Now they were applying that lesson against him. Their consciousnesses felt real to them, their wills mattered to them, and his philosophy gave them perfect justification for what they were about to do. Ruin watched the fleet assemble from his throne room, feeling the presence of each lord through the Force. He had known this was coming. Perhaps he had always known, but knowing and accepting are different things, and some part of him still believed his power would be enough, that his certainty would overcome their numbers. He called for Eradicus, his loyal squire, the one follower who had never questioned, never wavered, never shown the slightest doubt in Ruin's philosophy. The young man appeared within minutes, his force-infused armor gleaming even in the dim light of the throne room. "They have come to kill me," Ruin said without preamble. "All of them. Together. What do you think of that?" Eradicus knelt, his head bowed. "They are fools, Master. They do not understand that they exist only in your consciousness. How can the unreal destroy the real?" Ruin looked at this faithful servant, this perfect adherent to a philosophy that was about to be tested in the most visceral way possible. For just a moment, he felt something almost like affection. Then the feeling passed, buried under layers of certainty and pride. "Defend the palace," he ordered. "Make them pay for every corridor, every room. Show them the cost of betraying truth itself." The bombardment began an hour later. The attacking lords were not subtle. They wanted Ruin dead, and they wanted it done quickly before other lords could arrive to complicate the situation. Turbolus of fire rained down on the palace's shields, each impact sending ripples of energy across the protective barrier. Inside, Ruin's defenders prepared. These were the loyalists, the true believers, the Sith who still accepted his philosophy completely. There were fewer than he had hoped. Many of those stationed on Imperium had quietly withdrawn in the days before the attack, sensing what was coming and choosing not to die for a losing cause. The shields fell after 6 hours of sustained bombardment. Immediately, landing craft descended, disgorging thousands of troops and dozens of Sith warriors. The battle for the palace began in earnest, and it was brutal in ways that shocked even those accustomed to the casual violence of the Sith. Ruin fought personally, standing at choke points where his presence could make the most difference. His mastery of the Force was staggering. Attackers died in groups, their bodies flung against walls with bone-shattering force, or simply crumpling as he crushed their organs with a thought. His lightsaber was a blur of crimson light, deflecting blaster bolts, severing limbs, leaving trails of the dead in his wake. But there were too many. For every attacker he killed, 3 more pressed forward. His defenders fell one by one, overwhelmed by superior numbers. Corridors became charnel houses. The beautiful geometric architecture of the palace was scarred with blast marks and stained with blood. Eradicus died protecting an approach to the throne room. He faced 5 Sith warriors simultaneously, his enhanced armor allowing him to withstand blows that would have killed a normal being. He fought with absolute devotion, every movement executed perfectly, every technique employed with precision, but precision cannot overcome mathematics. The warriors overwhelmed him through sheer persistence, their blades finally finding gaps in his defense. Ruin felt the death through the Force, and felt something crack inside him. Not grief exactly. He did not grieve for things he believed were not truly real, but something else, a recognition perhaps, that this being who had served him perfectly, who had believed in him completely, was now gone, and the galaxy was different because of that absence. If he was not real, why does his absence feel like loss? The thought came unbidden and was immediately suppressed. There was no time for philosophy now, only survival. Ruin broke the silence. "You are nothing," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "All of you. You exist only because I perceive you, and when I cease to perceive you, you will simply stop." Vindictus laughed, the sound bitter and hard. "Then why are you bleeding, Ruin? Why do you fear? If we are not real, our blades cannot harm you, yet you stand ready to defend yourself. Perhaps you are not as certain as you pretend." The fight began without further preamble. 7 Sith Lords, each powerful in their own right, attacked simultaneously. Rodan met them with fury that bordered on madness. The Force exploded outward from him in waves, throwing back several attackers, giving him room to engage. His lightsaber moved faster than thought, blocking strikes from multiple directions, countering with attacks that forced his enemies back. He was magnificent. Even those trying to kill him could recognize the mastery he displayed. Decades of Jedi training, combined with years of dark side power, created a warrior who transcended normal limitations. But he was 1, and they were 7, and they were not ordinary Sith. These were beings he had trained, empowered, elevated to lordship. They knew his techniques because he had taught them. They understood his tactics because they had studied under him. Darth Sovereign fell first, Ruin's blade taking him through the chest during an overextended lunge. Animus screamed rage and hurled Sith lightning, forcing Ruin to divert attention to defense. In that moment of distraction, another lord struck from behind, their blade carving through Ruin's shoulder. First blood. The Dark Lord staggered, but did not fall. Instead, he spun, using the momentum to decapitate his attacker. 2 down, 5 remaining. But the wound weakened him, slowed him fractionally, and fractions mattered in combat like this. The duel continued for nearly 20 minutes, an eternity in a fight between Force users. The throne room became a battlefield of its own. Furniture shattered, walls scarred, the air thick with ozone and the metallic taste of blood. 2 more lords fell to Ruin's desperate skill, but each death cost him wounds and energy he could not afford to lose. Finally exhausted and bleeding from a dozen injuries, Ruin found himself forced back against his own throne. Vindictus stood before him, flanked by Animus and 1 other lord. All 3 were wounded, But they were standing. Ruin was barely holding his lightsaber, his strength failing. "Any last words?" Vindictus asked, his blade leveled at Ruin's throat. Ruin looked at them, really looked at them, and in that moment something broke inside him. Some wall he had built in his mind to protect himself from truth. They were real. Their hatred was real. Their determination was real. He had been wrong about everything. "You are real," he whispered, the admission costing more than any wound. "You were always real. The Jedi were right. I sought to transcend them and became less than nothing." Vindictus showed no mercy. "Any last words?" he repeated. "I am Darth Ruin," came the reply, bitter and broken. "I sought absolute truth. I found only ruin." 3 lightsabers struck simultaneously. The Dark Lord, who believed he was the only thing truly real, died surrounded by beings he had claimed did not exist. His body slumped against the throne, and the new Sith Empire lost its founder. The 3 victors stood over the corpse for a long moment. Then Vindictus turned to Animus. "We need to discuss how we will divide the territories." Animus's response was to ignite her lightsaber and attack. Vindictus barely blocked in time. The Third Lord, seeing the fight begin, made his own decision and fled, not willing to risk death now that the primary objective was achieved. Vindictus and Animus fought across the throne room, over Ruin's still warm body, each trying to kill the other. The coalition that had united to destroy their master lasted less than 5 minutes after his death. Within the hour, fighting would spread throughout the palace as different factions of the assault force turned on each other, each trying to claim Ruin's throne, his territories, his resources. The Sith nature reasserted itself immediately. They had proven Ruin's philosophy wrong by killing him, but they had also proven it right. Individual will did supersede all else. Personal power was the only truth that mattered. And when there was no overwhelming force to constrain them, the Sith would always inevitably turn on each other. Darth Ruin was dead, but the war he started would rage for another 970 years. The new Sith Wars had merely been given their name. Their conclusion would not come for centuries. And all of it, every death, every atrocity, every moment of suffering, traced back to one Jedi Master who asked questions he should not have asked and embraced answers he should not have accepted. In the ruins of the throne room, as the palace burned and Sith fought Sith in corridors slick with blood, Ruin's final expression remained frozen on his dead face. It was not pride, not certainty, not even anger. It was something far more human and far more terrible. It was understanding, arrived at too late to matter. The body of Darth Ruin was never properly buried. In the chaos following his death, as the coalition of lords fragmented and turned on each other, his corpse was simply left where it fell. Looters eventually stripped the throne room of valuables, including Ruin's lightsaber and the ornate belt that held his few personal possessions. The body itself was likely consumed in one of the fires that swept through the palace in the weeks after the siege. Fitting perhaps for someone who believed only he existed. In death, he was treated as though he had never existed at all. But the empire he founded did not die with him. That would have been too merciful. Instead, it fractured into dozens of competing domains, each led by a self-proclaimed Dark Lord, each claiming to be the true heir to Ruin's vision. The new Sith Wars, named for Ruin's new Sith Empire, would continue for nearly 1,000 years, a millennium of conflict, devastation and suffering that transformed the galaxy into something darker than it had been before. Vindictus survived his duel with Animus. Though barely, he claimed Imperium and several nearby systems, declaring himself the new Dark Lord of the Sith. His reign lasted 3 decades, longer than most expected, but the pattern Ruin had established held. Vindictus's own apprentices eventually conspired against him, and he died much as his master had, betrayed by those he had elevated to power. Animus escaped the palace and retreated to her laboratory worlds. There she continued her experiments, creating increasingly twisted creatures through Sith alchemy. Her madness grew along with her power, and eventually she became as much monster as master. The exact circumstances of her death are lost to history, but records suggest her own creations turned on her, no longer controllable even by the one who had made them. Darth Sovereign, who had fallen during the assault on Ruin, was remembered primarily as a cautionary tale. His administrative brilliance had made him valuable, but his combat skills were insufficient when philosophy gave way to violence. In the Sith Empire that emerged from Ruin's death, bureaucratic excellence meant nothing without the power to defend it. The pattern repeated across the years, and across the territories. A Sith Lord would rise, claim power, build a domain, then betrayal would come, either from within or without, and a new Lord would take their place. The new Sith Empire became new Sith Empires, plural, each lasting months or years before fragmenting further. Approximately 250 years after Ruin's death, a figure known only as the Dark Underlord appeared. Historical records are frustratingly vague about this being. Some sources suggest he was a revenant, a spirit bound to physical form through Sith sorcery. Others claim he was simply a brilliant commander who cultivated an air of mystery. Whatever his true nature, the Dark Underlord managed to unite a significant portion of the fractured Sith under his banner. His forces, known as the Black Knights, ravaged Republic space with a coordination that had been absent since Ruin's early campaigns. They struck at space stations along major trade routes, crippling Republic commerce and spreading fear throughout civilized space. For 50 years, the Dark Underlord's campaign ground on, neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The end came at a world called Malrev IV. There, Jedi Master Murtagh, desperate for any advantage, hired Mandalorian mercenaries to reinforce his forces. The combination of Jedi and Mandalorians proved devastating. The Dark Underlord fell in battle, and the Black Knight scattered. For a brief moment, it seemed the tide might turn in the Republic's favor. But the Sith simply reorganized under new leaders. The war continued. During this period, the Republic itself began to transform. The endless conflict drained resources, exhausted populations, and corrupted institutions. Democratic processes that had functioned for thousands of years broke down under the strain. Corporations gained power as governments weakened. Criminal organizations flourished in regions too devastated for effective law enforcement. The Jedi Order changed too, and not for the better. They became militarized, their role shifting from peacekeepers to warriors. Young Padawans were rushed through training and sent to fight before they were ready. Masters who had spent lifetimes studying philosophy found themselves commanding armies and making decisions about who lived and died. One Jedi, writing in private journals that would later be preserved in the archives, captured the tragedy perfectly. We have become what we fought. Not Sith exactly, but warriors first and keepers of peace only in memory. The children we train now know war before wisdom. They know killing before meditation, and I fear what we are creating, what we are becoming, in our desperation to survive. Around the year 1250 BBY, a Sith Lord named Balia Darzu rose to prominence. She was a sorceress of tremendous power, perhaps the most skilled practitioner of Sith alchemy since Animus. Her particular innovation was the creation of techno-beasts, organisms infected with Sith-created nanogenes that turned them into cyborg monstrosities loyal only to her. Darzu established her power base on Tython, a world sacred to Force users. Its desecration, a deliberate insult to both Jedi and earlier Sith traditions. From there she launched campaigns that brought the Republic to the brink of collapse. Her techno-beasts were nearly impossible to stop through conventional means. They felt no fear, required no rest, and could overwhelm defenses through pure relentless assault. For 20 years, the Sictis Wars, as this period was called, devastated the galaxy. Planets fell to Darzu's forces. Entire populations were converted into techno-beasts, creating self-sustaining armies that grew with each victory. Refugees fled into the core worlds, bringing tales of horror that seemed almost mythological in their extremity. Darzu's downfall came not from the Republic or the Jedi, but from fellow Sith, the Mikrosa Order, nominally allied with the Sith but based in the Tapanese sector, grew alarmed at how Darzu's campaigns were expanding into their territory. They poisoned her, a cowardly method perhaps, but effective. With her death, the techno-beasts became uncontrolled and her empire collapsed into chaos. But again, the war did not end. New leaders arose. The cycle continued. By the year 1000 BBY, the conflict had raged for a millennium. Entire generations had been born, lived and died, knowing only war. Historical records from the period paint a picture of a galaxy exhausted, traumatized, barely functioning. The Republic had contracted to a fraction of its former size. Many worlds were abandoned. Their populations fled or dead, leaving ruins that would not be resettled for centuries. This period, the final century of the new Sith Wars, became known as the Republic Dark Age. It was perhaps the lowest point in galactic civilization, a time when the very concept of civilization seemed on the verge of extinction. The Sith themselves were hardly better off. Constant infighting had reduced them from Ruin's organized empire to squabbling warlords barely distinguishable from pirates. They held territory, yes, but administered it poorly. They commanded forces, but those forces were as likely to turn on their masters as fight the enemy. The dark side had given them power but no wisdom, strength but no stability. One particular Sith Lord of this era, a being named Lord Khan, recognized the fundamental problem. He saw that individual Sith Lords claiming supremacy over each other led inevitably to conflict and weakness. His solution was radical. He proposed a brotherhood of darkness, where Sith Lords would be equals, sharing power rather than competing for it. The idea was compelling enough to unite a substantial portion of the remaining Sith. They gathered on Ruusan, a world in the Mid-Rim, for what they believed would be their final campaign against the Jedi. There they would demonstrate the power of unified Sith, crush the Jedi army of light that opposed them, and finally achieve the victory that had eluded them for 1,000 years. The Seventh Battle of Ruusan became one of the most significant engagements in galactic history, though not for the reasons either side expected. The fighting was brutal, neither side able to gain advantage, both suffering catastrophic losses. In desperation, Khan deployed a thought bomb, a Sith superweapon that killed through the Force itself. The detonation annihilated nearly everyone present. Jedi and Sith died by the hundreds, their souls trapped in the weapon's blast, their bodies left as empty shells. The Brotherhood of Darkness was destroyed completely. The Jedi army of light was devastated, its leadership killed, its forces scattered. In the aftermath, the Jedi believed they had finally won. The Sith were extinct, destroyed by their own weapon in a final act of self-destructive hubris. The war was over. Peace could finally return to a galaxy that barely remembered what peace felt like. They were wrong. One Sith survived. A single Lord who had opposed Khan's strategy, who had not been present at Ruusan, who had watched the Brotherhood's destruction and learned from it. His name was Darth Bane, and he would succeed where Darth Ruin failed by learning from Ruin's mistakes. The ruins of Ruusan smoldered for weeks after the thought bomb detonated. Recovery teams, both Republic and civilian, moved through the devastation, cataloging the dead, attempting to identify remains that the weapon had left eerily preserved. It was grim work, made worse by reports that some Force users could still feel the presence of those killed, their spirits trapped in some way by the nature of their deaths. Among those cataloging the aftermath was a young Jedi historian named Brielle. She had not fought in the battle, was not even particularly skilled in combat, but she understood the importance of preserving knowledge, of learning from what had happened so that it might never happen again. As she moved through the ruins, recording data, she kept thinking about a question that troubled her deeply. How did we get here? How did 1,000 years of war begin? The answers, when she eventually found them in archives that had survived the war, led her back to a name that few remembered: Phineas, a Jedi Master who had left the Order 2,000 years earlier, one of the Lost 20, commemorated with a bronzium bust in the temple archives, remembered as a philosopher who had pursued his own path. Only later, after correlating Phineas's departure with the beginning of the new Sith Wars, did the truth emerge. The Jedi Master who left peacefully and the Dark Lord who initiated centuries of devastation were the same being. Phineas had become Darth Ruin, and the Jedi had never known. The revelation shocked the Order. They had honored the memory of someone who had destroyed countless lives. They had taught generations of Padawans that Phineas represented the respectful disagreement of equals, a master whose conscience led him away from the Order. The truth was so much darker. But it also led to deeper questions. Questions that Jedi scholars would debate for generations. Could Phineas have been saved? Were there warning signs that were missed? How does a brilliant, respected master fall so completely that his own colleagues do not recognize him when they face him as an enemy? Among those who studied this question most intensely was Darth Bane. He was not a Jedi, of course. He was the Sith who survived Ruusan, the one who watched the Brotherhood of Darkness destroy itself and recognized that everything the Sith had done for 1,000 years had been wrong. Bane spent months after Ruusan in solitude, studying every holocron and text he could acquire. He traced the history of the new Sith Wars back to their source, analyzing what had worked and what had failed, looking for patterns that might explain why the Sith kept destroying themselves. He found his answer in the story of Darth Ruin. Ruin had united scattered Sith clans, bringing them together under a single vision. He had even converted 50 Jedi to his cause, an achievement no Sith Lord before or since had matched. His initial campaigns were brilliant, his empire expanding rapidly, his philosophy giving his followers a sense of purpose beyond simple conquest. But it had all fallen apart, and Bane understood why. The problem was numbers. The problem had always been numbers. Ruin had tried to build a Sith empire with hundreds of Sith, but each of those Sith was ambitious. Each wanted power. Each believed, ultimately, in their own supremacy. This was not a corruption of Sith teaching. This was Sith teaching. The dark side elevated the individual, celebrated personal power, encouraged the strong to dominate the weak. Put hundreds of beings with that philosophy together, and they would inevitably turn on each other. No amount of rhetoric about unity could overcome the fundamental nature of the dark side. Ruin had learned this. Khan had learned this. Every Sith Lord for 1,000 years had learned this. They simply kept trying the same solution, building armies of Sith, and wondering why it always ended in betrayal. Bane proposed something radical. The rule of two. One master to embody power, one apprentice to crave it. When the apprentice became strong enough to destroy the master, they would take their place and train a new apprentice. This cycle would continue, each generation stronger than the last, until finally the Sith were powerful enough to destroy the Jedi completely. It was elegant. It solved the fundamental problem of Sith organization. With only 2 Sith at any time, conspiracy was limited. Betrayal was expected, even encouraged, but it was controlled. The strong survived. The weak were eliminated, and most importantly, the Sith's existence could be kept secret from the Jedi, allowing them to grow in power without interference. Bane took an apprentice, a young woman named Zana, and disappeared into obscurity. The Jedi, believing all Sith were dead, lowered their guard. They demilitarized, slowly, painfully, trying to return to what they had been before the war transformed them. The galaxy began to heal. But the Sith endured. In shadows, in secret, following Bane's rule of two, they passed knowledge and power from master to apprentice for 1,000 years. Darth Bane to Darth Zana, Zana to her apprentice. Generation after generation, hiding, waiting, growing stronger. Until finally, that lineage produced Darth Plagueis, who trained Darth Sidious, who became Emperor Palpatine, and achieved what Darth Ruin had only dreamed. The destruction of the Jedi Order, the fall of the Republic, the establishment of a Sith Empire that ruled the galaxy. The irony was profound. Ruin's failure had taught the Sith how to succeed. By proving that large numbers of Sith would always betray each other, he had inadvertently shown them the only path that could work. His grand experiment in Sith unity had demonstrated that Sith unity was impossible. And that lesson, that negative example, became the foundation for everything that followed. Historians studying the rise and fall of galactic civilizations often point to Darth Ruin as a pivotal figure, not because he succeeded, but because his failure was so instructive. He attempted something unprecedented, uniting the Sith through philosophy rather than simple fear. When it collapsed in ways that illuminated fundamental truths about the nature of the dark side. The dark side is inherently individualistic. It elevates personal will above collective good. It encourages strength at the expense of cooperation. These are not flaws from the dark side perspective. These are features, but they make sustained organization nearly impossible. Any Sith Lord who tries to build an empire, who tries to command legions of dark side users, will face the same problem Ruin faced. Those followers will eventually apply the lessons they learned to their teacher. If might makes right, if strength justifies authority, if personal will supersedes all other considerations, then why should they serve rather than rule? So Ruin tried to solve this through philosophy, through convincing his followers that only his consciousness truly existed. It did not work because philosophy cannot override reality indefinitely. His followers experienced themselves as real. They felt their own thoughts, made their own decisions, suffered their own pain. No argument, however elegant, could permanently convince them otherwise. Later Sith Lords tried different approaches. The Dark Underlord cultivated mystery and fear. Dazu used techno-beasts that had no will to betray. Kanan tried radical equality. All failed. All failed. All fell to the same pattern. The Sith turning on themselves, consuming their own strength in internal conflicts, wasting their power on betrayals that benefited no one. Only Bane's solution endured, not because it was morally superior, but because it was mathematically sound. Two Sith cannot have civil war. Two Sith can maintain secrecy. Two Sith can plan across generations without hundreds of ambitious lords undermining those plans for personal gain. And yet, even Bane's success contained echoes of Ruin's failure. When Darth Vader finally turned on Emperor Palpatine, when he threw his master down the reactor shaft to save his son, he was repeating the pattern established 2,000 years earlier. The apprentice destroying the master, personal will asserting itself against authority. The Sith nature expressing itself as it always had and always would. The difference was context. Vader's betrayal destroyed the Sith rather than just changing their leadership. But the fundamental dynamic was the same. The dark side builds power but cannot sustain organization. It creates strong individuals but not strong institutions. It succeeds in moments but fails across time. This was Darth Ruin's true legacy. Not an empire, not a philosophy, not a military conquest, but a lesson about the inherent limitations of the path he chose. He proved that the dark side, for all its power, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. not from external enemies, though those matter, but from internal nature. The dark side elevates the self. The self seeks supremacy. Multiple selves seeking supremacy inevitably come into conflict. This is not a solvable problem within the dark side framework. This is the dark side framework. Ruin wanted to transcend the Jedi by embracing absolute individualism. He ended up proving why the Jedi emphasis on collective harmony, on connection, on service to something beyond the self was not weakness but necessity. Cooperation requires seeing others as real. Sustainable institutions require valuing others as more than tools. These were lessons the Jedi had learned over millennia. Ruin unlearned them in his pride, and the galaxy paid the price for 1,000 years. The Jedi archives on Coruscant contain thousands of years of recorded history, carefully preserved through wars and upheavals, maintained by generations of archivists who understood that memory is civilization's first defense against repeating its darkest chapters. Deep within those archives, accessible only to masters and senior scholars, sits a data cube containing everything known about the Lost 20 Jedi Masters who left the Order across its long history. 20 departures that the Order commemorated not with shame, but with respect, acknowledging that even the wisest could find their paths diverging from the collective. Bronze busts lined a special gallery, each face preserved in metal, each name inscribed below. Among them stands Fannius, the first of the 20, or one of the first. The records are unclear on exact chronology, as some departures occurred so long ago that precise dating becomes impossible. But Fannius is there, his umber features captured in bronze, his expression thoughtful and calm. The plaque beneath his bust reads simply, "Master Fannius departed to pursue independent study, remembered for his intellectual courage and philosophical depth." For 2,000 years, young Jedi passed this bust without knowing the truth. They saw a master who followed his conscience. They learned that sometimes the wisest choice is to step away from institutions that no longer serve your growth. The bust represented tolerance, open-mindedness, the acknowledgement that the Jedi way was not the only way for every being. None of them knew they were honoring a monster. The truth was discovered gradually, pieced together across decades following the new Sith Wars. A historian here would notice that Fannius's departure coincided with the beginning of the conflict. A researcher there would find references to Darth ruin that seemed to describe someone with Fannius's philosophical inclinations. Slowly, reluctantly, the connection became undeniable. The debate about what to do with this knowledge consumed the Jedi Council for months. Some argued that the bust should be removed, that honoring ruin in any form was intolerable. Others contended that removing it would be rewriting history, hiding from uncomfortable truths rather than learning from them. Still, others suggested leaving it but adding context, acknowledging what Fannius became while still preserving the record of what he was. In the end, they left the bust unchanged. But they added a restricted addendum to the archives, accessible only to those with proper clearance, explaining the full truth. Master Fannius became Darth Ruin. The Jedi who left peacefully became the Sith Lord who started 1,000 years of war, and the Order chose to remember both truths, to hold them in tension, as a reminder that even the brightest minds can fall if certainty replaces humility. But who was Fannius? Really, strip away the legend, the mythology, the centuries of historical analysis. Who was the being beneath the philosophy? The earliest records describe a talented Padawan, unusually gifted in force manipulation, showing aptitude for both physical and mental disciplines. His master, a Rodian whose name has been lost, reported that the boy asked remarkable questions, demonstrating insight beyond his years. But even then, there were warnings. He struggles with empathy, the master wrote in one evaluation. He understands others intellectually, can predict their actions, manipulate their emotions, but he does not feel with them. There is a coldness in him, a distance, as though he observes life rather than participates in it. The Master recommended additional training in compassion, in connection, in the aspects of Jedi philosophy that emphasize unity over individuality. Whether that training occurred or whether it was effective, the records do not say. But by the time Phineas achieved knighthood and eventually masterhood, he was known primarily for his brilliant mind rather than his warmth of spirit. He took few Padawans. Those he did take universally respected his teaching, but rarely felt close to him personally. One, interviewed centuries after Phineas's departure, described their relationship as intellectually stimulating but emotionally barren. The Padawan learned much but never felt truly known by their master. This pattern continued throughout Phineas's career. He was respected, admired even, but not loved. Colleagues sought his counsel on complex problems but did not invite him to informal gatherings. He was included in important debates but excluded from the casual friendships that sustained other masters through difficulties. Perhaps this isolation drove his philosophy. If you do not feel connected to others, if their inner lives remain mysterious and distant, the leap to solipsism becomes smaller. If you have never truly felt another consciousness touching yours, it becomes easier to question whether that consciousness exists. Or perhaps the causation ran the other way. Perhaps his philosophy created his isolation, his certainty that only he truly existed, making genuine connection impossible. Which came first? The loneliness or the belief? The records do not answer, and perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps they fed each other, spiraling deeper with each iteration, until Phineas was trapped in a prison of his own making. What we do know is that his fall was not sudden. There was no single moment of corruption, no dramatic turn to darkness. It was erosion, slow and steady, each small compromise leading to the next. He questioned Jedi teachings. He explored forbidden philosophies. He convinced himself that restrictions on knowledge were about control rather than wisdom. He stole a Sith holocron. He left the Order. He united the Sith. He started a war. Each step seemed reasonable from the perspective of the previous one. This is how darkness works, not through obvious evil that anyone could recognize and resist, but through incremental shifts that appear justified until you look back and see the distance traveled. By the time Phineas became Darth Ruin, he was unrecognizable as the Jedi he had been, not just in philosophy but in presence. Those who knew him before and encountered him after reported that it was like meeting a completely different being wearing a familiar face. The coldness that had been a character flaw became his defining feature. The intellectual pride that had been troubling became monstrous. The questions that had been philosophical became dogma. And what did he achieve with his transformation? What did all that certainty, all that power, all that conviction accomplish? He started a war that lasted a millennium. He created an empire that fractured immediately upon his death. He converted 50 Jedi who mostly died in the internal conflicts his philosophy generated. He developed a school of Sith thought that proved unworkable, abandoned by every successor. He became a cautionary tale, a name used by later Sith to describe everything one should not do. His legacy is measured in suffering. Trillions dead across 1,000 years of conflict. Civilizations destroyed. Knowledge lost. Progress halted. The galaxy set back centuries in its development. And all of it traceable to one Jedi Master who convinced himself that only his mind was real, that only his will mattered, that everyone else was just shadows in his consciousness. The tragic irony is that Ruin was brilliant, genuinely, remarkably intelligent. If he had remained with the Jedi, if he had channeled his philosophical inclinations toward constructive rather than destructive ends, he might have been remembered as one of the Order's greatest thinkers. His questions about the nature of consciousness, about certainty and knowledge, about the relationship between perception and reality, these were legitimate philosophical inquiries. But he sought answers in the wrong place. He looked to the dark side, which offers certainty without wisdom, power without responsibility, strength without connection. And the dark side gave him exactly what he asked for. It confirmed his worst impulses. It validated his most destructive beliefs. It told him he was right when he was catastrophically wrong. This is what the dark side does. It does not create monsters from nothing. It takes what is already within someone and magnifies it, removes constraints, eliminates doubt. Arvenius's coldness became Ruin's solipsism. His intellectual pride became absolute certainty. His distance from others became the belief that others did not exist. The Jedi who studied his fall saw in it a map of how corruption works. First comes the question, then the conviction that the question is more important than the answer, then the belief that institutions restricting inquiry are enemies of truth, then the willingness to break rules in pursuit of knowledge, then exposure to teachings specifically designed to exploit these tendencies, then the gradual acceptance of those teachings, then the transformation into something unrecognizable. At what point could he have been saved? The question haunts Jedi scholars. If the Order had been less restrictive, would he have felt less need to rebel? If his master had addressed the empathy issues more directly, would he have developed the capacity for connection that might have prevented solipsism? If his colleagues had included him more, would he have felt less isolated? Or was his fall inevitable? Was there something in his fundamental nature that made this outcome unavoidable, regardless of external factors? The debate continues, and it matters because the answer shapes how the Order trains future Jedi, how they identify warning signs, how they intervene when masters begin showing troubling patterns. What we can say with certainty is that Darth Ruin serves as perhaps the clearest example in galactic history of a principle the Jedi teach from the earliest stages of training. Connection matters, empathy matters. Recognizing the reality and validity of other consciousnesses matters, not just morally, though that is important, but practically. Ruin's philosophy made him powerful in the short term. It freed him from moral constraints. It allowed him to sacrifice others without hesitation. It gave him the certainty to make decisions that others would agonize over. But in the long term, it destroyed him. He built an empire on the belief that only he mattered, and that empire immediately proved him wrong by turning on him the moment it was able. His followers were real. Their ambitions were real. Their wills were real. And because he refused to acknowledge this reality, he could not account for it, could not plan for it, could not prevent it. His philosophy was his greatest weakness, disguised as his greatest strength. Compare this to the Jedi approach. The Jedi teach connection, empathy, service to something beyond the self. This appears weak from the dark side perspective. Why serve others if you could dominate them? Why value their consciousness if you could simply impose your will? But the Jedi approach builds sustainable power. It creates institutions that last millennia. It develops relationships where beings genuinely support each other rather than waiting for opportunities to betray. It acknowledges reality rather than denying it. Other beings are real. Their needs matter. Working with them rather than against them produces better outcomes across time. This is not weakness. This is wisdom. And the 1,000-year gap between Ruin's fall and the Jedi's near destruction by Palpatine demonstrates which approach is more durable. The Jith survived through secrecy and limitation, hiding themselves to avoid self-destruction. The Jedi endured openly, building a civilization that, for all its flaws, provided stability for countless beings across thousands of years. Ruin wanted to transcend the Jedi. He wanted to prove that their way was weakness and his way was strength. He failed, Not because he was not powerful, but because power alone is insufficient. Not because he was not intelligent, but because intelligence without wisdom is dangerous. Not because he was not certain, but because certainty without humility is blindness. In his final moments, he understood. The records suggest that his last words acknowledged the reality of those killing him, admitted that the Jedi had been right, recognized that his entire philosophy had been a lie, he told himself. But understanding came too late. The moment you need that understanding is not when you are dying, but when you are making the choices that lead to that death. The name Darth Ruin has become, in Sith lore, synonymous with failure through hubris. When later Sith study the history of their order, when they analyze what works and what does not, Ruin represents the cautionary tale. He is the example of what happens when you try to organize the Sith through philosophy alone, when you believe your certainty can overcome the fundamental nature of the dark side. Even Sith, who celebrate individual power and personal supremacy, recognize that Ruin's approach does not work. They understand, in ways he never did, that other Sith are real and must be treated as such. You can dominate them, manipulate them, eventually kill them, but you cannot pretend they do not exist. That way leads to betrayal. You cannot anticipate because you refuse to acknowledge that the betrayers are capable of independent thought. For the galaxy at large, for beings who never studied the Force, who never encountered Jedi or Sith, who simply lived through the new Sith Wars and suffered their consequences, Darth Ruin is barely remembered at all. The war lasted so long, involved so many different Sith Lords, created so many layers of devastation, that its origin became irrelevant. It was simply the war, the endless conflict, the thing that defined life for generations. But historians know, scholars know. Those who study how civilizations fall and rise, how wars begin and end, how ideas shape reality, they know that it started with one Jedi Master, asking questions, not bad questions initially, not evil inquiries, just questions. Questions about the nature of consciousness, questions about certainty and doubt, questions about whether we can truly know anything beyond our own minds. These questions are not inherently dangerous. Philosophers across the galaxy have asked them for millennia, but combined with pride, with isolation, with exposure to teachings designed to exploit philosophical inquiry for destructive ends, they became weapons. Weapons that Phineas turned on himself first, destroying who he had been, and then on the galaxy, creating suffering on a scale that still defies comprehension. There is a meditation taught to Jedi Padawans once they reach a certain level of training. It involves contemplating the lost 20, considering what drove each to leave, understanding that even the wisest can lose their way. When they reach Phineas in this meditation, instructors tell them the full truth. This respected master became that destructive lord. This philosophical inquiry became that genocidal war. And then they ask the Padawan a question. Could this happen to you? Could you make the same choices? Could you follow the same path? The honest answer, the answer that leads to wisdom, is yes. Anyone can fall. Anyone can convince themselves that their truth supersedes all others. Anyone can mistake certainty for clarity. The defense is not believing you are immune. The defense is humility, connection, and the willingness to doubt yourself before you doubt the reality of others. These are not guarantees. Nothing guarantees against falling, but they are the best protections available. In the end, Darth Ruin's story is not really about the Sith or the Jedi. It is about a more universal truth, about what happens when intelligence divorces itself from wisdom, when power serves pride rather than purpose, when certainty replaces curiosity. These patterns play out on scales large and small, in contexts, force-sensitive and mundane, across all times and all places. Phineas could have been a great teacher. Darth Ruin was a great warning. Perhaps that is legacy enough. Perhaps the suffering his choices created can at least serve to prevent future suffering if people learn from his mistakes. Perhaps the name that means destruction can also mean instruction. The galaxy turns, civilizations rise and fall. The force flows through all things, connecting, sustaining, indifferent to the philosophies beings create to explain it. And somewhere in the archives, a bronze bust stands silent, commemorating a departure that led to darkness, honored not for what it became, but as a reminder that the path to ruin begins with steps that seem reasonable. The story ends, but the lessons remain, and perhaps that is the only redemption available for someone who caused so much harm. Not forgiveness, which he neither sought nor deserved, but usefulness, the usefulness of a cautionary tale told across millennia. Be humble in your certainty, value others as real, connect rather than isolate, question yourself before you question reality. These are not Jedi teachings specifically. They are survival strategies for conscious beings trying to live together in a complicated universe. Darth Ruin forgot them. The galaxy paid the price, and we remember so that the price need not be paid again. The stars drift in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the brief flickers of beings beneath them. The force flows on, through light and dark, life and death, connection and separation. And on Coruscant, in archives that have survived wars and empires, a name is preserved. Not celebrated, not honored, simply remembered. Darth Ruin, the Jedi who became a Sith, the philosopher who became a warlord, the seeker of truth who found only lies. The consciousness that believed it alone was real, destroyed by those it claimed were not. His story is told, his warning is given, and in the quiet spaces between words, in the pause before sleep, claims the listener, perhaps understanding comes not of Sith or Jedi, particularly, but of the human condition, the universal struggle between connection and isolation, between humility and pride, between seeing others as real or as shadows in our personal narrative. We are all real, all of us. Every consciousness matters. Every will has validity. This is not weakness to acknowledge. This is the foundation of everything worthwhile that civilizations build. And when we forget it, when we decide that only our truth matters, only our perception is valid, only our consciousness is real, we walk the path that Pharnius walked. It leads nowhere good. It ends in ruin. And the name itself, chosen with such certainty, becomes a prophecy fulfilled in ways its bearer never intended. Sleep now, listener. The tale is told. The archive is closed. The lessons rest with you to accept or ignore as you will. But remember, as you drift toward dreams, that consciousness is precious, yours and everyone else's. Treat it accordingly. And perhaps the galaxy will be a bit better for that. Remembering. The story of Darth Ruin is complete. May we learn from his fall. May we avoid his mistakes. May we build connections rather than certainty. And may we remember always that we are not alone in reality. We share it with billions of other minds, each as real as our own, each deserving acknowledgement. That is the lesson. That is the legacy. That is what remains when empires fall and philosophies crumble and names become warnings rather than honors. Remember it well,